can. And knowing the first meeting we had double these participants, probably, I'd imagine some folks will begin to drop in. So anyway, there's going to be a few new faces today, so I'd like to just take a moment. My name's Jeff Burns. I'm with the Oregon Department of Forestry and the Partnership and Planning Program. And I'm really kind of heading up with this team, 762 legislation and the Forest Resiliency program, along with Alex and Megan and Ryan, and Derek Gasparini is helping us with our public affairs as well. So I see 2 new faces, maybe 3, if we could just go around, and we'll start with ODF folks, just to get on the same page, and then we'll move right into more of the meeting that we wanted to jump into. So Alex, why don't you go ahead?
Afternoon, folks. Alex Rommel. I'm also working in the Partnership and Planning Program, and this work group is focused on Section 18 and the Forest Restoration and Resiliency Investment Program. I'll be working on the Small Forestland Grant Program, which is Section 24, and helping Jeff and the group here as needed. Thanks.
Ryan, I'll try to do this with some organization. I see you next on my list.
Thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon, everybody. Ryan Gordon. I'm currently serving as the Interim Partnership and Planning Program Director with ODF.
Megan, I see you.
Hi there, good afternoon all. Megan Inley, I'm admin support for the Partnership and Planning Program.
Okay, unless I'm mistaken, I think that's the ODF folks that we have. And so that's kind of our team that we have assembled to help this along. Pete, I see you next.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pete Caligier here, the Forest Strategy Director for the Nature Conservancy here in Oregon. Good to be with you.
And Dallas, you're a new face. Why don't you say hello to folks?
Hi, Dallas Holder-Fries. I am with Baker County as their Sage Grouse Local Implementation Team Coordinator.
Thank you. Welcome to the group. Jason, I see you as well, and you're a new member.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Jason Simmons. I am the Oregon-Washington Fuels Program Lead for the Bureau of Land Management. Glad to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Colin, I see you next.
Hey, I'm Colin Beck. I'm the Forest Lands Manager for the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Sayusla tribes.
Welcome, Colin. Thank you. Dr. Emily Jane Davis, I see you.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Jane Davis. I'm the Interim Director of OSU Extension's Fire Program.
Thank you. Chief Chambers, I see you next.
Good afternoon, Chris Chambers, Wildfire Division Chief for Ashland Fire and Rescue.
Okay, now I'm moving over to kind of a sidebar. I'm not seeing faces, but I'm seeing Eric Hartstein. Why don't you say hello?
Oh, hey, Jeff. Hey, everyone. Afternoon. Eric Hartstein, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. I'm the Board and Legislative Policy Coordinator.
Great. Dylan, I'm seeing you next in line there.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Dylan Cruz. I'm the Director of Government Affairs and Program Strategy at Sustainable Northwest.
Okay. Amanda, I'm seeing your name.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Amanda Astor, Forest Policy Manager for Associated Oregon Loggers.
Great. And Chandra, I see you.
Hello, this is Chandra Legui with Oregon Wild.
Thank you. And then I'm seeing a number, 541-270, so on and so forth.
It's Maury Kramer.
I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit.
Hello.
Hello, 541-270.
Yep, this is Maury Kramer from Select.
Oh, thank you. Okay, and then I see another number, 928-856.
Hey, Jeff, this is Andrew Owen with Nrcs, and sorry to call in. I'm trying to get you up online as well as we speak.
Okay, Andrew, thanks for joining. All of you, thank you so much for joining. Have I missed anyone? Okay, well, there might be some folks that pop in and out throughout the afternoon. Thank you for taking the time. And immediately I'll just ask, I guess everyone has the agenda in front of us so we can, to some degree follow along with that to help guide our conversation. But before we do that, I know that Ryan Gordon had something he wanted to bring up with the group very quickly, and then we'll move on to the agenda items.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And I'll try not to take a lot of time. I know this is an add-in here up front. Just getting right to it. I've been thinking a little bit about public engagement in the process that we're all working on here. And as we outlined on the first day when we met, one of the key things we're doing is capturing, summarizing the contents of these conversations and posting that on ODF's external website, making it available for folks to review. And they have the opportunity there to submit comments, which we can then take and summarize and share with all of you in advance of meetings as discussion evolves. But I think it's also important, just in the spirit of keeping the process open and transparent, while at the same time, kind of straddling, also keeping the conversation focused and productive, recognizing the quick timeline that we're on, that we offer at least one open public forum for folks to engage with this conversation a little bit, ask some questions, and maybe provide some feedback. And so the conversation that I've kind of started, and it's I'm still forming the idea in my head, but I think what we'd be driving towards is an evening listening session. Potentially, our tentative date right now that I think Jeff and I discussed is October 25th. It'd be something on the order of maybe 6 to 8 in the evening. And it would be an opportunity for us. So ODF would drive this. We're not, I don't want to make a big ask of all of you, other than that I would hope if your schedules permitted, you'd participate in that and be available to potentially engage in some of the conversation. But we would drive that session, offering the public a presentation of the process and some of the outcomes of that process, kind of where it's at that point. And then offer them the opportunity to ask questions and provide some feedback, which we would then capture and summarize. I just think it would be a really nice opportunity to potentially collect some viewpoints, make sure that we're not overlooking anything, and give everybody a little bit of insight into the work you all are doing. So that's the idea anyway. Wanted to spring it on you all today, recognizing the quick timeline that we're on. But hopefully you're all amenable, and I'll just pause and see if anybody's got any big concerns or feedback. Emily Jane.
Glad you brought this up, Ryan, because two questions I was going to bring this group today were, one, if and how are we going to get any outside input on the RFP process? I've had a few people ask me this already and express a desire to provide input. And I wouldn't call them general public members. I'd call them informed stakeholders who want a chance to weigh in. And then I've also been asked, is there any way to give people a little advance information about what we're planning, by late October or something like that, so they're better prepared to respond on a pretty tight timeline for an RFP that's going to be out during the holidays, essentially, and that's expecting a lot of partnership. And so all that to say, those are the two questions I had, and I'd be curious to say, what are we going to know, and what are we promising to deliver at that session, and be really concrete about what we can offer and what we're asking for, which I know you know already as a former social scientist.
I don't know if I have that all figured out. I think that, so my sense, and Jeff, feel free to jump in here. My sense is by then we'd have a pretty good sense of the priority landscapes that you all are focused on, as well as the criteria. And I think, that being the case, it would also be a perfect opportunity to give some folks insight into, what's coming, per the feedback that you received, Emily Jane. And then, we'd have kind of a verbal Q&A format then, and then offer probably on a pretty short timeline, considering the overall timeline that we're on, say maybe 5 to 7 days for folks to submit written comments to us as well for summary. That's what I'm envisioning. Jeff, does that line up, you think, with where you're hoping we'd be at by then?
Absolutely, yeah. And I would just remind everyone that we're continuously working on updating our webpage. And so there will be some written information, including our summary notes there, that others can follow along with and help prepare themselves for maybe that public input on October 25th. That might be useful for that information as well.
Yeah, and part of the reason I wanted to bring this up now is that obviously we've got to get the wheels turning to get word out about this comment on the calendar. And Emily Jane, just occurred to me too, you know, the other thing, the place where I'm less certain and I want to be really careful is that we have to clearly help people understand the decision space and how feedback they provide will be used. And that's something where I want to give that some more thought before we throw this out there.
Chandra, I see your hand.
Yeah, related to that, I was just going to say it will be important to clarify for people how this particular process and meeting ties in with some of the other things going on under the umbrella of SB 762. You know, there was just the comment period on the WUI that that just passed, and I know there's probably some other things. So that'll be good to clarify, but also I'm curious if we have a good sense, and I'm not tracking those other RACs rulemaking stuff really. How do those timelines line up with some of our timelines as far as maybe not confusing the public when we're offering things like this, but also how could they inform our building of criteria and the RFP, because that seems kind of important too.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Certainly in this presentation on the 25th, we could try to put a little perspective around that in terms of where this body of work fits in with other moving parts. I've also, in generating this conversation about this particular event, just in talking with our public affairs program, we're trying to kind of spin up the capacity to, I think, more regularly generate some outgoing messaging to help people understand the different moving parts and where they have opportunity to participate in the process. So I'm hopeful that will come as we kind of get this machine spinning, recognizing that everything is moving on a very fast time frame.
Amanda, your hand's up.
Yes, thank you, Jeff. The other thing that I just wanted to mention along the lines of public engagement is Section 18, subsection 5 specifically talks about a public notice and opportunities for public input related to the selecting of landscapes. So just wondering if that meeting would specifically serve as that opportunity for input, and just wondering how the department intends to provide that public notice.
So certainly that's part of my thought, reflecting on that specific piece of language. And in terms of notice, I think it would get noticed the way we notice all of our meetings. And I can work with our public affairs program to get a more specific answer if you'd like, but it would go out through our all of our channels through, we might even have Gov delivery by then. I can't think of the service that we use right now, but anyway, through our standard service that we use for noticing all of these meetings. And clearly through your networks as well.
Any other thoughts about that October 25th meeting? Okay, well, thanks. Go ahead, Ryan. I'm sorry. Did you have something else?
I was just saying thanks for the time, and also just occurred to me I'm going to have to drop off at 4 o'clock. I apologize for that, but looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. I just noticed a note here from Dana Skelly with the Forest Service as well. and she'll be a few minutes late, but we'll be jumping on. And Chris Dunn has sent me an email as well, and he'll be available in about 5 minutes also. So to wrap that up, it sounds like we're working on 2 different opportunities for public input. One is through the website, the public comment, that we'll synthesize those comments and bring them to the group. We can certainly open those conversations and unpack that a little bit more throughout the process. And then also an exclamation point on October 25th, when we'll actually have some real-time interaction. And hopefully all of you will be able to join, and we'll be able to talk about our process and how we're moving along before the last meeting, where we will then be able to kind of bring all that together and hopefully, wrap in some other items or other public input in the process. So anyway, with that being said, thank you for that bit right there. If we could, I'd like to reflect a little bit more on the agenda. And from my perspective, there's 2 big rocks that I hope we can break today. And one being that, we need to discuss strategic landscapes in some detail. We have some map products that Chris Dunn and some others have been able to provide that we can begin to chat about that. And then also the second big rock really is, it was brought up at last meeting, one that we've been thinking about through the e-board process as well, is, are there tag and extend projects out there that are already up and running, that make sense, that are available, that meet the criteria that we can discuss in these strategic landscapes, and move some money quickly to those projects and get ahead of the game in the next couple of weeks, rather than delaying and waiting on our entire process to take shape. So those are 2 items I hope we can discuss. Any questions or thoughts about that before we get into some particulars? Okay, I see that. Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, just really quick. And I know that we're going to get into it, but well, maybe I can just hold off until we get to the tag and extend question. So I'll just hold off.
Okay, great. But duly noted. I hope we get there, and if we don't, then remind us. So I noticed that Chris has joined too. Thank you, Chris. I just want to maybe give a little bit of background on what I and some of our staff here, and really Chris and Andrew and some others have put together some products that really make a lot of sense that maybe we can discuss. And some of this language goes beyond me. I'm no GIS specialist, but we have some folks here that can inform that. So anyway, I'm going to share screen real quick and maybe open a conversation about landscapes and some of the products that we're looking at. And I noticed in last meeting that we had some requests of, can we add, this layer and this layer? I would say that the language is pretty clear in the legislation of what the QWRA means and what we're actually supposed to be looking at. And I would also say that as interesting as some other layers might be, it's probably pretty important in a time-sensitive way that we come up with 2 or 3 locations that make sense and we move, because we do need to get some funding on the ground to some of these projects. And I would certainly be happy to listen to other arguments as we go. But let me start with this just to bring the conversation around a little bit. Let's see, there's one. Is anyone seeing that map?
Yep.
Good. Okay. The other couple that we've been looking at, I'll start with this one. Can you see the e-board projects that we had previously?
It's just a black.
Okay, so here's an opportunity maybe to have this conversation. And Chris has done a great job in putting this together, and speak to it, please, Chris. But we have existing projects, existing projects that are on the ground that are already in some level of completion. And some of those were e-board funded 8 months ago or 6 months ago. Some have been built upon year after year after year with various levels and colors of funding to get to a particular place in the process. And so what we've been able to do here is just show for some model that we have some e-board projects as examples that are already on the ground in high priority landscapes, as the QWRA would lead us to believe here. And so let's just pull one out. Let's say Douglas Firewise. Okay, a project that is treating fuels on the ground. The Rogue Siskiyou, there's another one. West Bear, all lands down south. So I'm hoping to get some feedback from you folks about, does it make sense to move with priority landscapes that we can define and integrate existing projects where funding and effort has already been put, and we can go through that process to add a little bit more, increase acreage, and be able to finish up or take projects into the next level of completion.
Hey, Jeff, it looks like some folks might be having trouble seeing the map too. I don't know if it's possible to email it out to the members here.
Certainly. Yeah, let me do that.
Chris, I had to click out of it, by the way, in the gallery mode and actually click on the map for what it's worth. I don't know if you're able to do that or if it's something else on your end.
Chandra, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. And I can see the map just fine for what it's worth. Yeah, I appreciate, wanting to be as efficient as possible. And in between meetings, I emailed Alex about trying to get some more information about these e-board projects because for me, I don't, I'd like to know more about them and, what sort of measures of effectiveness are, sort of being put on them. I don't want to charge ahead with extending anything when I don't know, what the goals are and whether they've been achieved. And so I definitely would just like a lot more information before, committing ourselves to projects, these projects or projects like these without applying our own, sort of going through an organic process of, developing the criteria that this group thinks are right and without knowing more about these projects.
Great. I'm really glad you brought that up, Chandra, too. And I was expecting that, and I'm glad you did. So the projects that we have that we can reference, and we can do this offline as well. I don't expect to necessarily pick a bunch of projects today and everyone just feel good about it when we move forward. But I'm proposing that we have a week or so of homework where we actually have some folks that are, we have an opportunity to drill down and look at some of these. And so the projects that we would be discussing would have been vetted through a rigorous process of RCPP, Joint Chiefs, Western States Fire Managers, projects that have already gone through the process of being open, transparent, competitive, and vetted by subject matter experts and those on the ground that are making them work. And we have the opportunity to identify those that make some sense in the landscape that we are already looking at as being a high priority or strategic landscape, and then being able to just add water and grow. And that's really what I'm really proposing here, that we have that information. And so I would like to offer throughout the next couple of hours that conversation and move into the next step of providing documentation to the work group through the rest of the week, over the weekend into next week, so that you have time to take a look at these and be comfortable with where we are with it. Although I would say, with the end goal of funding projects and moving forward, rather than waiting 2 to 3 months before we get anything on the ground. So that's the point. Dylan, I see your hand.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So 2 clarifying questions. One was EJ's question in the chat there. So select e-board project locations. Are those e-board projects that were funded and are within the 4 areas? And then other are ones that were funded but are outside of the 4? Is that the difference?
Yeah, great point. And I just made this up myself. Sorry, I forgot about that. This is just from my perspective. So the feedback is obviously welcome here. What I did is I looked at how much money was already spent. Did they already tap out and spend the funding that they had and complete acres? And the other layer would be, is it in what my perspective is of a strategic landscape?
Okay.
So that's only from my perspective. But
Okay.
some of the other projects, for example, and I have some right here, might have been under contract or had an agreement of, say, $200,000 and came in at $89,000.
Okay.
And maybe had the scope of work, they might have said that they were going to complete 300 acres and only completed 112 acres or something. So the next step for us as a team as well is to take a look at these projects very specifically and do some ground truthing if we want to go down this path, and put these numbers together that make sense on paper to us. But then it would require a call to the project manager on the ground to have that conversation. Is there capacity there? Do you feel that you could move forward with some extra funding and finish the project? Do you have landowner interest? Do you have partnerships? What is the process for you to tag and extend and continue this project into something that is successful?
Okay. And then, so then my second question then kind of related to that, and I do like this approach. I know we'll talk about this as a group. This is largely what we're seeing here, e-board projects. And some of them may be in there, but is this inclusive of those Nrcs conservation implementation strategy areas or RCPPs or joint chiefs? And then for OWEB, is this covering focused investment partner areas? Because I have a hunch that some of those landscapes may not be covered on this map if they weren't funded in the e-board process or selected in the e-board process. So maybe Eric and Andrew can speak to that a little bit, maybe add some nuance in this conversation or in the follow-up homework.
You bet. And I'm lining these out just in my small mind of what I can see and kind of absorb. And so I want to move to another couple of maps that, just for me at least, become a little bit more complicated and further the conversation along. But please, Andrew, Dana, if you have some other thoughts, please jump in.
Dylan, I'm not sure I have an answer, but more of a question that may help round out an answer. I know of projects that are in the queue. For example, there's Joint Chiefs up in NEO that is in the queue for funding. Are we considering those, or only ones that are already awarded? Same thing with RCPP. If they're going through the queue, do we want to consider expediting the process instead of waiting for the national award? For example, we could speed up that process. So I don't know if that question made sense or not, but I think that may help round out Dylan's question.
Yeah, real quick, can you see this NRCS map that focuses on CIS, RCPP, and Joint Chiefs? Okay, and then I'll just reveal one more, and we'll get to a point where I think we've brought the conversation to a more holistic point of view here. Okay, does that work? Gosh, this is tough. I wish we were all in the same room just talking. Okay, and Chris Dunn put this together. Thank you, Chris. Okay, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, the only I have to add in relation to Dylan's question and some of the discussion we just had is I have a list. We do updated integrated 5-year plans for all the forests every year. And as part of that, we have a running list of targeted fuels investments. That's how we keep track of the shelf stock we have for hazardous fuels work in both states, so that when additional money comes up, we're pretty nimble and able to allocate it without having to go through a new data call and a new prioritization process. So when, if as part of the homework, I'm happy to break out just the Oregon pieces and have it ready to talk about at the next meeting. That's not a problem at all. It's prioritized by forests with their top 5 to 10 projects, which indicates that they have the capacity to implement those. So we can look at that in relation to our shelf stock and then our priorities in this group. And without having to call the forest, I could tell you right off the bat what we have capacity for right now. So happy to share that on the next call, or if there's time later here. Either way is fine.
Okay, I'm seeing some hands. I noticed Chris and then Eric and then Dallas. Go ahead, Chris.
I think you mean me, Chris, and not Chris Dunn, right?
Right.
Okay. At the risk of shooting myself in the foot here, Ashland would check a lot of these boxes, and we were a recipient last year of eBoard funds, and I see a lot of funding processes go this direction, which it makes a lot of sense. But I would really encourage us to reserve some amount of the pot of funding to go to develop capacity in underserved areas. Like just to take for an example, the Rogue River Basin, Ashland, and we've got West Bear right next to us, doing a lot of work over a lot of years, checking a lot of the boxes. But if you move to another part of the Rogue Basin, say Prospect Butte Falls up to Crater Lake, hardly anything is happening in those areas. So perhaps if there's a way to create a category for developing the capacity to implement, because you got to start somewhere, right? And maybe this is a good stepping stone for some of the underserved areas to be able to get into the other RCPPs and FIPs and and start thinking larger and getting into that world of funding. But just to reserve that conversation and hope that we can create an opportunity for folks who aren't already checking the boxes to get into the game.
Some thumbs up out there. Good comment. Eric?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And Dylan, to your question about OWEB and the Focus Investment Partnership Program. So we currently have FIP investments in the southern part of the state, Ashland, Rogue Basin. So it's probable that some of those points intersect with our FIPs, as well as in Northeast Oregon, and Dallas could probably speak to this better than I could, with the Baker Sage Grouse Focus Investment Partnership. Some of those other dots or points are not associated with an OWEB FIP, but there's a possibility that we do have a regular or open solicitation grant program project in the vicinity of some of those.
Okay, Dallas?
Yeah, thank you. Part of this is probably just clarification because I missed the first meeting and just trying to catch up here. But I am curious as far as knowing fully well that this is a pretty forest-centric group, but are any of these projects that you have listed, do they specifically not include any rangelands? Or are they part of the eBoard process? That's something I'm not familiar with. And then just kind of to what Chris was just saying, I know, looking from a rangeland perspective, a lot of that Malheur County is the southeast part of the state, have like an RCPP kind of in the works, as well as Tri-State is working on some fuel breaks down there and stuff, but I'm not sure to what level those are at, but those obviously aren't captured in these projects here. So just curious as to kind of what you're thinking as far as like if you were to say how much of the money you kind of want to put into these pre-existing projects versus how much do we kind of want to bide our time and look a little bit more closely at some undeveloped projects that are still out there.
You bet. Great points. And, let me chat with you perhaps, offline. I'd love to bring you up to speed on a little bit of what ODF has been doing with eBoard projects and that. I'm happy to do that. Great point. And I'd like to make some notes now about maybe moving the conversation into a little bit of a conceptual area, because I know there's a school of thought that we focus funding into 2 or 3 large projects, and we just focus funding on a small area and we hammer the heck out of it. And we make huge strides in fire behavior, ecosystem restoration, so on and so forth. But I'm also hearing that there's opportunities to reach out and provide seed money to excite new communities, to get new people involved, and to build out projects across the state. Those are 2 probably in the context that we're discussing with $20 million and 18 months to complete the job. These are 2 diametrically opposed issues here that we're probably not going to be able to do both. I'm only saying that just for conversation's sake. Tell me I'm wrong. The language in 762 does focus specifically on expected net value change of the QWRA. So we are limited to some degree by bill language, timeline, and amount of funding. Comments, thoughts? Dallas, you still have your hand up, or is that from last time? Dylan, go ahead.
Before I go, I don't know if Andrew had his hand up, if you wanted to add anything with regards to maybe some of the sage-grouse habitat areas.
Thanks, Dylan. I appreciate that. Not necessarily, it was a clarifying question just to make sure that we're all speaking the same language. On the e-board funding, Jeff, I think it's important to dissect the jurisdictions of where the funding's going. So with the funding you have here that we would be tagging and extending, we're talking about non-industrial private forest, generally speaking, larger landowners. Because if I'm not mistaken, there's more funding to tackle more of the firewise. So that's, I guess, question number 1. If we get into the Joint Chiefs, tag and extending, we're going to have the federal land jurisdiction. And then maybe a placeholder for further conversation is we haven't really touched on municipal lands. And I think that's really important that we fold that in, as they play a huge role in changing the fire dynamic across the landscape. So just recognizing, dividing this by jurisdiction may be another way that we can have a conversation. I'm respectfully, Jeff, as always, I think it's important to disagree. I do think we need to plant some seed money. From all the signaling that we're getting, there's going to be a real significant increase in budgets in the next decade. And I think positioning ourselves well to receive that and to be very successful with that, I think this seed money could, it doesn't have to be major significant amounts, but I think we ought to be strategic in how we put seed money out there. So as the new farm bill, as new, state money comes out, we're positioned really well to be successful with that.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And that's why we're here to discuss. Dylan, before you go, one quick clarification for folks is that the reason that I brought up eBoard as an example only was because it was general fund. And so it's the same color of money that we're working with now. We've had years and years of utilizing federal dollars on federal land, private land. I mean, there's a multitude of cross-boundary projects that we have worked on. But the example of this particular eBoard funding is that we used general fund a year ago, and now we're in the process of using more general fund. And so that's really the connection with what color of money it is. Dylan, go ahead.
Thanks, Jeff. And I appreciate the comments from Andrew there. Yeah, I do think we do both. I think, as a group, we should decide on how much is going to be going to existing projects and tag and extend. I think it should be a pretty robust investment just because they are ready to go. And that's where we're going to be able to show the most demonstrated change in condition. I do think we should also, have these kind of focal areas and make a substantial enough investment that we can treat enough percentage of the acres to be able to make these claims. But as far as, whether that's half of the money or more, we should talk about. But for some of the seed money, it's definitely apparent to me that we should be trying to do a project within Southeast Oregon in that range context. I'm glad to have Dallas here for this, and I think NRCS would be helpful there too. Seeing a lot of opportunities around Ontario and Burns there, I think we can do some good work. And then there are a few pockets where there are some emerging opportunities. So maybe that seed work is a little bit smaller in scale so that we can temper some of the expectations about what can be accomplished in a shorter period of time and then prep them to receive more money down the road. And then if we do these tag and extends, we can get those agreements initiated with them by the end of the year here. And then they have the full extent of the 18 months to really implement and match those dollars. So I hope we can do both, but kind of refine what can be accomplished with the new projects and for what purposes those seed money are being invested.
Thanks. Amanda, I see your hand, and then Dana. No, you're on mute, Amanda.
Thanks, Jeff. You think I'd know how to do that by now, but so kind of going off of what Dylan said related to the tag and extend, this is sort of the question that I was going to ask before, but since we're already started talking about it, I'm going to bring it up now. I'm wondering, Dylan, you used the word of percentage of projects or funding to go to those types of projects. I'm wondering, if that's the direction we want to go, which I think that it should be, again, similar to the reasons that Dylan mentioned. Are those projects competitive? Who applies for them? I'm just wondering what that process looks like. And kind of who is in charge of that, just so generally that's one question I have for those types of projects. And then the second one, a lot of what we've talked about, Nrcs, OWEB, Forest Service projects. What about BLM? How do we engage on BLM lands? Not just forested BLM lands, but rangelands as well. A lot of the money that we're talking about right now goes to federal lands or private land. So again, just wondering how we engage on the BLM lands in the process.
Great points. Dana?
Always slower on the mute than I'd like to be, right? And I'm sure I'm alone there. So just building on some good points overall. In my mind, this is building a couple of different discussions. What we can do right now, which is what you're trying to get us to focus on, Jeff, which is spot on. And then we have the 20-year strategy conversation on deck. And then in between, there's probably some mid-strategy opportunities too. And the one question I have for right now, in addition to like what we want to do on the landscape, is are there some data needs that we could be digging into? Does this money give us an opportunity to do that, to set ourselves up for the next two questions? Like I know in the last push this spring, you funded some research to look at salvage logging a little bit. And so are there some things on sustainability, market capacity, things like that? Because as we look at the long-term needs, EJ brought it up on the last call. I know it resonated with a lot of us. Like, where do we have capacity and what will it take to grow capacity to meet those needs that everybody's hitting on? I think having some better data to work with to be the foundation for the longer term discussions is going to be pretty critical. And is there an opportunity to use some of this funding or some other part of the 762 funding to help us be set up for the longer term discussion? Because I think we have what we have. The next 2 years is going to take a little bit of work, but it's pretty straightforward because what's there is there. What do we need to do to be proactive in the right places for the next round? So thanks.
Yeah, great point, Dana. And thinking of Amanda's comments as well, ODF is one player in this. We're not the player. And so when I think of our staff and some of the projects that we've worked on, we've focused on fuels mitigation pretty specifically. We did have some opportunities to collect data and to support some of our partners in that effort. But it's as we interpret 762, and we could probably talk for the next 12 days about what that actually means. I think from my perspective, originally, the focus of the legislation was to remove fuels and to improve, the fire ecosystem and protect infrastructure and communities. But I certainly would be happy to have that conversation, and maybe we can help define that on what do, if we carve out something for, some other planning project, what does that look like? And keep in mind, of course, again, I'd remind everyone that we're on a pretty finite timeline here with this funding as well. Dylan, you have your hand up? You're on mute.
Sorry, I meant to put it down.
Oh, okay. So one reminder as well. Oh, Pete, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Jeff, to try to sneak in there at the last minute.
Right.
I just, a couple observations I wanted to share. I really would second a lot of the comments that were made. So just to get my voice in the room a little bit, a couple things that I've been thinking about. One, I think, is sort of this idea that, like, yes, there's strategic landscapes, and then there's, I think, a finer filter there of treating strategically within strategic landscapes that needs to be considered. And I'm not necessarily sure, I'd like to assume that some of these prioritized landscapes or already selected landscapes that are receiving funding through various programs are already doing that. But I think that that's something important for us to also consider, again, to be able to demonstrate that we've done the right work in the right place at the right time to really make a difference. I think that's going to be important. That relates to a second point, which I'm thinking of, which is, far be it for me to kind of think about the political calculus here. I leave that to folks like Dylan. But I think the important consideration also is that this is, I think, but one drop in the bucket. And that's not to undersell this investment, but the goal, I see it as a long-term goal here of really demonstrating the effectiveness of a program like this in the long term so that we can go back and get more. And I know everyone's already thinking about that, but thinking about what kind of social and political, thinking about what kind of projects are going to help us build that social and political license longer term so that we can go back, make a case for further funding, increased funding, and more sustained funding over time, because we're certainly not going to solve this in one biennium. And then I think, a final, well, maybe I'll save it for the future, but I think one final point that I might just throw out there for consideration is, in addition to criteria that are sort of enumerated in the bill, I think there might be another layer or lens here we could view some of these high priority or strategic landscapes with, and that's sort of social and community vulnerability. And I know that there's been some important work done out there looking at some of those factors that put different underserved communities at higher risk, or help us understand where those communities that bear kind of a disproportionate share of wildfire or smoke risk are in Oregon. But I think that might be something else. I just expect that going forward, that there's going to be more and more scrutiny about how work is addressing those issues of, equity and the communities that are really suffering the most from some of these exacerbated risks from increased fire, increased smoke, and climate change. So something else for us to just maybe weigh in our criteria. So.
Great, thank you, Pete. I would mention, and thanks for the segue, I had a conversation with Heidi Huber Stearns just yesterday. Maybe it was the day before, I don't even remember. Oh, that was Sunday, probably not. And we discussed EWP, Ecosystem Workforce Program, and EJ, you may jump in here at any point, but we have utilized that group in the Federal Forest Restoration Program to monitor and report out items for years, and had a great long-standing relationship with them. They do incredible work and have really helped tell the story of federal forest restoration. We do have a line item within our budget to provide some funding to continue to contract with them in this context as well. So we will have an opportunity to kind of unpack that with that group and be able to, really nail down what kind of items we'd like to report on to tell our story, Pete, so that there's a point when we can go back to the legislature and really tell, all the success that we've had and promote maybe some future funding opportunities and new partnerships at the same time. But that being said, I think that Heidi would like to circle back with the group perhaps in the next week to 10 days and really kind of plan that out a little bit better. So I don't know if I can speak much more to that. I'm seeing some hands. EJ?
Yeah, Jeff, I'll just add that Heidi and I are going to dig into that more. And I appreciate the kind words about the monitoring that we've done in the past. I think it needs to be ramped up significantly for investment of this scale, and probably needs to be made more sophisticated. At the risk of sounding like I'm throwing my own work and partners' work under the bus, we really need to increase the sort of ability to track outcomes, the ability to use geospatial information. Just we have a good foundation with prior monitoring done through the FFRP, but this is going to need to really level up.
Okay, good. I hope this is an opportunity we can build upon that. Thank you. Alex, I'm noticing some comment here in the chat and some things maybe you brought. Do you have something to speak to there?
Oh, that's just the social dimensions of wildfire. So if you guys get a chance, maybe that's offline, but it gets us some of those unequal impacts that Pete was mentioning. Obviously, it doesn't tell the full story, but additional resource for folks to look over maybe after the meeting here.
Great, thank you. Okay, if we could circle back, unless there's Ryan, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Hopefully I put my hand down. I can't tell, but anyway, I was just thinking a little bit too about, the scope of this work. I think we're really focused on creating resilient landscapes. And I guess where I'm going with this is just thinking about, are we focused specifically just on reducing fuels, or are we taking a little bit of a broader look at forest health in general and landscape health, really, because we're talking about range here as well. I'm just thinking where my mind is at is thinking about, the private lands that are involved in this work as well, and recognizing that folks have a lot of different values and goals and objectives on their land. And we've got a pretty good toolbox that we can bring to bear to address a suite of needs. And a lot of them, ultimately connect back to fuels reduction at the end of the day. But there's a suite of benefits and values. And I'm just thinking about that from the perspective of, maybe I'm channeling you a little bit, Andrew, if you're still there, of, NRCS investments on private land. So I just wanted to throw that out there for folks to think about. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense.
It sure does, Ryan. And if I see someone else's hand, I'm happy to jump in there. But that's again a nice segue to what I was kind of hoping to circle back to, perhaps. In maybe before we're done here today, we can at least you all can give ODF, our staff, some marching orders for the next week, say, to really build out and flesh out projects that we all feel would be appropriate to fund now, to continue to fund, and move forward with that. And whatever that looks like, if it's $600,000 worth of additional funding, then so be it. We can move on that. If it's 1.6, if it's 5.2, then so be it. If we can build some consensus around moving on some projects. And I want to give an example that Ryan kind of touched on or reminded me of. And it is the Rim Pawnina Gilcrest project that John Pellissier and Jason Pettigrew have been working on. So originally, this was funded with some ODF dollars, in that there was a portion of it on Gilchrist State Forest. And so our staff went out and had begun thinning and doing some work. And then there was an injection of e-board funds, which are general fund. And so we gave them a little bit more just 8 months ago, $250,000. And they've been coordinating with Deschutes National Forest to coincide their project right next door to prescribed fire preparation. Around the community of Gilcrest and Crescent, we've utilized Western States Fire Managers dollars, which are federal funds competitively awarded on a regional scale, actually across the entire, on a regional scale. And so there's some federal dollars there as well to protect infrastructure and defensible space around structures. So they've completed 1,100 acres of fire line preparation and thinning. And I just talked to John Pellissier not long ago, and he said, hey, another $300,000 and we could complete another 1,000 more acres. We could finish off our road system as contingency lines, and then we could begin to actually prep for a fall burn. And if that window doesn't show up, then we have an opportunity to implement prescribed fire across that landscape in the spring and potentially next fall as well to button all that up. So there's an example of multiple layers of project that have been built on top of each other for years and years and years that has not come to fruition for various reasons, because it's expanded, because there's new partners, because the window for prescribed fire hasn't availed itself. So whatever the case may be, I would like to maybe get to a point that we have some consensus that we can work on those particular projects this week, develop those out, get the information for you, do a ground check with those individual managers, and begin to move on a half a dozen to a dozen projects that make sense to us. Chandra, please.
Yeah, I guess my mind's going in a few different directions. One is just to take it makes sense to capitalize on some of those projects for sure. It's just a matter of how much of the pot goes there when we haven't even explored the possibility of projects outside of the bucket of the known quantity. So that's one of the big questions for us, I know, and we brought it up before. And then I guess it's related. We're charged with coming up with criteria for an RFP, and here we are essentially cutting off that process, depending on how much money we want to give to these existing projects. I mean, you're asking us to over the next week come up with some projects, looking at the things already on the list of things that should be funded, but that's constraining ourselves in a lot of ways by not going ahead and putting out a call a little broader than what we have now. So maybe something like that public meeting in October, and Emily Jane brought this up, she's getting questions already about, from people who might be interested in the RFP and want to know more. But I just don't want to cut ourselves off from really great possibilities already by constraining ourselves too much.
Alex.
So great point, Chandra. And ideally, I think the process that Jeff is describing is kind of the precursor to the development of criteria. And so that would be kind of some of the homework for you all to do individually. Say these are the things that are important for us in a project that gets funded through Section 18. And then we may be able to kind of sift through that lens, combine them all, and say, okay, these projects generally meet the majority of potential criteria that folks are responding to. I think we are getting, there's a big push here to get some funds on the ground, but I totally hear you that you guys are going to be in charge of developing our criteria, and we don't want to circumvent that process too much. And so the percentage of funding that might be, allowable, knowing that we've got 2 years to spend, if that's 5%, that would be $1 million. If it's 10%, something along those lines, I think would be really informative for us just to understand how much effort we should be putting in on that. And then I think we're getting the horse in a little bit, or the cart a little bit ahead of the horse here, in that, first we'd like to identify where the priority landscapes are. And if these proposed projects aren't within priority landscapes, then I think that would automatically take those out of consideration. And Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that would be the first criteria, is if they're not in a draft priority landscape that you guys are developing here, then we might put that at the bottom of the list.
Absolutely, Alex. And I wanted to kind of put the cart before the horse to some degree, specifically to kind of to paint a picture for everyone of what an end product might look like. And now that that's been done, let's talk about priority landscapes and how we can fit those projects in, or how these projects fit within those priority landscapes. So thank you. Yes. And if it's the group's decision to not move, that's fine. This is not ODF's decision. But just keep in mind all of the hills we need to climb to get there. And eventually, I would propose, and this is what we're also working on, Alex and myself and our staff, is that we put language in front of you all that is a request for proposals, and it's a draft document, and you can beat it up and cut it up and move it the way you want and get it to the point that we're ready to roll that out. And we'd use probably Alex's template that he used 8 months ago for the e-board funding and start moving forward with that language until we can get something that we're all comfortable with. Amanda, please go ahead.
Yeah, first, just a clarification here, Jeff, because it's cut off, can you let me know what the polygons with the dots in them represent? I think it's cut off on my screen at least.
NEPA shelf stock.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, copy. Yeah, just the top of the legend was cut off, so I couldn't see what that was. I know the shape of some of those, so I should have just guessed that, but okay, well that helps. Just again trying to look at where these are located and going back to the strategic landscapes piece. I think the bill says that we should prioritize lands that are in the 4 highest, risk classes from the QWRA, but it doesn't say that we can't work outside of those. It just says that we should prioritize those. So again, looking at where these projects are, there really are a lot that are outside of those HUC 10s. There's a handful within, but just wanted to point that out to the group as far as, as we start to think about the strategic landscapes and other things that we might want to consider. But yeah, just looking at this, there really are not a whole lot of polygons within the NEPA shelf stock, Joint Chiefs, or CFLR-P that are in those polygons. So anyways, just wanted to point that out, but really wanted to know what that polygon with the dots was in it. So thank you.
You bet. Chris, did you have a comment? Chris Dunn?
No, I was just letting Amanda know what the dots were.
Okay, great. Well, and really, I think that maybe we've circled the conversation, and I really appreciate all the input. That maybe we've circled to a point that we can really get to strategic landscapes that we can identify. We can draw some circles on a map and begin to really focus on that. If that takes a little bit of homework in the next week, then so be it. But we have a little bit more conversation there, as opposed to, or not opposed, but in relationship to additional projects that are outside of those areas. And maybe we even put some numbers on there. And maybe Chandra has some ideas, as she's brought that up, that there is a percentage of funding that goes to existing. There's a percentage of funding that goes to strategic landscapes that we identify, and there's a percentage of funding that goes to seed money. That would give us some context of maybe what folks are thinking about in the overall picture. Does that make sense? Thank you, Ryan. We'll see you. Pete, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Jeff. I also think perhaps, I think Chandra, it was you maybe in the chat made the comment about the language in the bill about testing or different fuel treatment types. Was that correct? But if that's, I can't remember who it was. But regardless, I think that the other piece that I'm interested in here is this is a little bit back to that concept, the concept that the goal here is really also about landscape resilience in addition to reducing wildfire risk. And I think in some of these systems, particularly, obviously the places where we're working more closely in our dry, more frequent fire adapted forest ecosystems, I'm interested in that, looking at projects that are attempting to get some of the treatments that maybe aren't happening as often or as frequently or at the scales needed. So thinking about Dana's data on NEPA, NEPA shelf stock and some of the priority projects, fuel treatment projects within Forest Service, I'm wondering how much of that might be able to be, how much of this money might be able to be channeled towards getting, say, even like the non-commercial mechanical fuels reduction, and then in particular also the prescribed fire pieces, and maybe even helping push some of the boundaries on some larger landscape scale prescribed fire implementation, so that we're kind of tackling multiple goals or desired outcomes at one go. We're sort of strategically treating at larger scales to increase landscape resilience, help conserve some of these dry fire adapted habitats and the biodiversity that depend on them, reducing risk by thinking about where some of like the landscape risk transmission is coming from that's putting some of these WUIs or human development, human infrastructure at risk. And then, simultaneously tackling some of that work that's, steadily building up on the federal land side and even on the private land side because of barriers to implementing prescribed fire. Maybe we can look at that as a way to sort of help test and challenge some of those barriers a little bit, and then also be able to put some relevant work on the ground that we can show back to the legislature, like, look, we're actually making a difference and getting work done that's sort of killing multiple birds with one stone. Not to use a bad analogy, but I don't know if that makes sense to folks. But I think that there is certainly, I think we know from the data that's out there and our own experience that some of the work that's not happening is some of the most important work that actually is showing increasingly to make a difference in the face of some of these larger wildfires. So I just think we should think about that as well.
Thank you, Pete. Dallas, I see your hand up, and then we'll get to Chandra.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to have a point of clarification, I guess, going back to what Amanda and Chandra were talking about as far as our process here. And so what I'm understanding is, like there's two paths. One of them is that we could kind of expedite giving some of this funding towards projects that are ready. And that would bypass kind of our RFP, but would then help inform the RFP. And in my mind, I think it makes more sense and would end up being a lot cleaner is if there's no issue in looking at these projects and kind of prioritizing them and using them as an example of what type of projects we're looking to fund through the RFP process. But I don't really see an advantage if they are ready for them to just go through the RFP process like all other projects. And I think that would really coalesce our thoughts and allow us to be more strategic with the way that we're spending our money and being able to rank projects kind of in a more structured manner. I understand getting money on the ground fast, but if those projects are ready, what's the, I guess, disadvantage to waiting to fund them, 2 months down the road in January when we're accepting RFPs with other projects?
Great. Let me give you a little bit of
misunderstanding that too.
Great, and thank you. And forgive me, we've probably skipped over a few items here. Only in the context of how ODF can manage a grant. And so here's an example. If it's over $150,000 of an award, it must go through DOJ review. And that could take a month or 6 weeks. So there is a delay there in doing that. We're talking also about field seasons. So we're going to get into some snow, we're going to get into some mud weather, and then next year we'll get into fire season, and much of the contractor community and project managers in the field come mid-May of 22 are on fires. And so we lose some capacity there. And so really when we look at the remainder of the biennium, we really need to think about all of those little steps that it takes to get to a project. And really, it's much more compact than we might think. And so that's only an example. There's other agreements and scopes of work and budgets that need to be reviewed and things like that in building out those projects. So there's a little bit of background. Happy to talk about that. But I noticed that Chandra has her hand up. Amanda, you had yours up earlier. Are we circling back to you eventually? Okay, go ahead, Chandra.
Cool, thanks. And yeah, I thought that was a really good point. I was going to say, related to what Pete was saying, that, well, you called me out, Jeff, for for mentioning, maybe having a percentage of already ready projects and new projects, but I definitely don't have a suggestion around that. But what I was going to suggest, as far as being more important to me, was similar to what Pete said, is, I mean, obviously we have to consider the location of these projects based on the mapping and where it makes the most sense and is going to have the most impact, but also types of projects, and that's what Pete was talking about. Types of projects that maybe are chronically underfunded, like prescribed burning, for example, or some of the non-commercial treatments that he mentioned. But also, I want to make sure to get in the point that we want to focus on treatments that are proven to have the most effect for community resilience, for example, or for forest health. And so I guess I'm more interested, as far as the criteria goes, in thinking through the types of projects and then applying those on top of the landscape and the location for what we're doing here.
You bet, Chandra. Thank you. And then I see Chris, and we'll get to Amanda, and we'll get to Pete. I think you had your hand up as well, Pete. Okay. Chris Chambers, please go ahead.
Thanks. I'm wondering, just as a floor for the conversation, is there direction within 762 in the legislation that actually kind of shows us the way in this? I've heard the expected net value change is actually kind of codified in there. Are there other pieces of the process that we have to follow in the legislation that we should not wander outside of the lines?
Well, good point. And I think that folks can interpret it in various ways. Some of the language in here is a little bit nebulous. It just kind of allows for some interpretation, but there certainly are recommendations and some direction. And I, rather than going word for word through it, we can probably tease that out to some degree. But I know that the other folks have been very close to this legislation. Amanda, do you have a comment?
Yes, it's not specifically to Pete's question, but
Chris, I'll get back to you. Go ahead.
Or to Chris's question. Sorry, Chris.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, we definitely need to auger into the bill. And so one thing that I wanted to mention, as well as, obviously including all of the criteria that is specifically spelled out in the bill, is also the fact that the bill more or less came out of the Governor's Council on Wildfire Response. That's sort of what spurred original legislation, which then turned into this legislation this past session. And so, of course, the mitigation subcommittee said that we needed to treat 5.6 million acres over the next 20 years, I believe. And so I don't know if that specifically is the for expected net value change, if these HUC-10s are specifically, if that is the 5.6 million acres that was identified by the mitigation subcommittee. But I do think that we should be using the mitigation subcommittee's report as sort of a North Star in a way, recognizing that there's already been a lot of work done to get here and that we don't have to start from zero. And we should be focusing on what some of the recommendations in that process were. So that's one. And then secondly, there's been some conversation about contractor capacity, and just how, what the timeline is and the fact that we need to get moving. And so, of course, prescribed fire is a huge part of this as far as the non-merchantable piece, but there's also commercial treatments that should be done in combination with prescribed fire. And so for the prescribed fire piece, recognizing that there's a lot of work that gets analyzed on specifically federal land that ends up not getting completed. And so there is a lot of shelf stock for prescribed fire projects. I'm wondering, first, I don't have all the answers. And I'm wondering kind of what the problem we're trying to solve is. So why is that work not getting done? Is it because we don't have adequate capacity? Is it because we don't have long enough burn windows? I'm wondering what the problem is, because I want to make sure that whatever we are coming up with here is solving that problem, and trying to figure out if it's a problem that we can even solve with money, right? Because that's what we have as our tool right now. So, so I don't know, Dana, if you're still on, if that's something that you could help us understand, just from the prescribed fire piece, at least on the Forest Service side, because again, if what we can solve with money is adding capacity, and other things, I'm just, from the capacity side, representing those contractors, I'm trying to think of how we solve the problem that we have with our fuel buildup in the woods, right?
Yeah.
Dana, if you have some comments, please go ahead, and then Alex, we'll get to you as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. And thanks, Amanda. So we've been having conversations with the contracting community about what it would take to increase capacity for burning. And the main thing that they've told us is that it takes stability of funding. And so on that side of things, so the big limiting factors on burning, and they're going to only get worse. I mean, there's smoke and the way we regulate smoke in the state of Oregon, and there's been a lot of really good ongoing efforts. And then recent opportunities in the smoke management plan have opened the door. Peat was a really big part of that. With the first example in Bend, I expect Ashland to come up with an exemption pretty soon, and we're seeing the benefits of that. But really, in the wake of climate change, I just want to say I love prescribed fire, and I think it's the best thing we could do. I think the windows are just going to keep getting smaller, right, for burning. So I think if we want to be realistic on solutions, looking at mechanical opportunities, looking at how to get the landscape ready for the burns, whether it's a wildfire or a prescribed fire, is the real best management practice, because we still had smoke on the landscape all summer long from the 2020 wildfires. And there were times where it's punking up and moving around inside the footprint in 2021 from the 2020 fires. Many of our burns that we lit this spring, and we had a great window, and we've been pushing well beyond our 5-year average with burn implementation in Region 6, but it's still a drop in the bucket of what we need to do. And we had those burns walking around in the landscape during the fire season this summer. Not many, but and not a big resource drain. Nothing escaped, nothing was converted. But the reality is that the good that they used to do on the landscape, I don't think those windows are going to present themselves as much as they used to. I think, again, we want to be ready for those opportunities, but I don't think it's going to be the tool that it has been in the past for us. So that's one piece. And then the other piece is the federal capacity is going to increase. There's a lot we can do with good neighbor authority and thinning crews. We've got some examples on the Umatilla and the Malheur where we've used good neighbor authority to hire thinning crews through the state to build implementation capacity that's been really, really value added. And it's a highly replicable model that I think we want to consider. And then the contracting community, they need stability of funds to increase their ability to support. So hopefully that's helpful. And thanks for teeing that up again.
Okay, Alex, and then I noticed Andrew had kind of waved maybe a little bit, but Alex, go ahead.
Well, this is great discussion, guys. And I wanted to circle back to a couple points that I heard about, we might call them planning projects, where they're non-treatment projects, but they get at answering some of those questions about the effectiveness of treatments and or monitoring, things like that. And so I don't think those are off the table. I mean, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, but we can definitely fund planning projects that help us better understand the effectiveness and the types of treatments that we need to do. And if that's involved in your guys's criteria as we build out, that's what we did in the e-board. Is we had implementation project criteria, and then we had planning project criteria. And so something like that, I think, would be possible to do here, right? The overall goal of Section 18 is to reduce wildfire risk, and part of that is better understanding what's most effective approaches to doing that. And then I do want to shift gears a little bit here because we've got a little less than 40 minutes left on the calendar, on the time here. And what I'm really hoping we can do is get some large bubbles on the map here that you folks can go back and take to your constituents. We'll probably get you a shape file, and you can overlay all sorts of data on these hypothetical priority landscapes. And then we could kind of bring that back next week and see what all that looks like, and if you guys want to bring your own edits to that shape file, we can overlay them. I think that would be a really useful exercise, knowing that we do want to identify priority landscapes, and a lot of the conversation here I think will be forthcoming in the discussion of criteria. And just knowing that we've got 40 minutes left to do that, I'm wondering if we might want to transition into identifying some general areas on the map. And I believe Chris Dunn is on the line with OSU, and he could even pull up the map and start drawing some boundaries if you guys feel comfortable with that.
How do we feel about that? I think that's a good stroke of business, Alex. We can get some pen to paper. Andrew, did you have a comment? I didn't want to skip over you.
I did, and hopefully it helps steer. I'll try and be concise. I wanted to ask one clarifying question, and then I had a comment. Jeff, you mentioned projects over $150,000 have to go to DOJ. Is that true for pass-through? If you were to do a sub-grant, for example, to a fire department at $300,000, okay, I see you shaking. No matter how the vehicle of money transferred, anything over 150. Okay.
Right.
And now I've got a comment and like to get some thoughts. The way that I've been really parsing this out over the last couple of weeks is breaking this into jurisdictions. We all have our ownerships in these areas, and by putting out one RFP, for example, I think that's going to be really difficult. And I don't know that we're going to get all the answers that we're looking for, where if we can start looking at this in jurisdictions at that level, this work has already occurred. The Forest Service has already done their prioritization. The tribal lands have done their prioritization. The private lands, we've done a lot of work. I'd like to almost get to a point where we can suggest financial contributions out of the full amount to each of those jurisdictions. I like drawing a line on a map, but I also feel like we're going to limit ourselves a little bit by doing that. We may find that we've got a 30,000 acre treatment that could be done in 18 months. Now, it might not fit in one of those bubbles, but that's a huge landscape to treat. Secondly, to that point, if we limit ourselves to geography and we're not getting applications from the rest of the state, we don't have that shelf stock the next time this opportunity comes up. So I think going through the exercise of looking locally at your area and what you can do and what shelf stock through partnerships is a very good exercise. This isn't going to be the last time we have an opportunity. eBoard came up and it was a shock. I think we need to set our folks up to be ready for this. So if we draw a line on a map and say thou shalt not apply if you're not in this, we're selling ourselves entirely short. And I don't think we ought to do that. I think we as the selection committee can set criteria and say, we're going to give you X many points if you fall in this landscape, or if you're proposing a fuel break adjacent to Forest Service land. I think we can set that. But I really think we ought to be careful on setting geographic boundaries too soon. We can do that through a pretty good ranking criteria.
That's a great point, Andrew. And I think back to Amanda made this point earlier, but it is prioritizing landscapes. And so I think if we get to a criteria standpoint and we want 60 or 75% of the funds to fall within priority landscapes, or there's a point system based on whether or not you're in a priority landscape or in a certain risk class, I think that is definitely something we could provide flexibility within the grant criteria or the RFP.
Absolutely, Alex. I think to know that we've got 30,000 acres of shelf stock in NEO, now we might not select it for this, but knowing that is going to pay huge dividends the next time this happens, or when the new farm bill comes. I think having that information and having that access, then we can show the legislature demand. You gave us 20 million. We had 60 million in really, really great projects. We're going to treat 20 million in the highest priority, our first cut, but legislature, no, there's another 40 million of very, very high priority. That's valuable data to have.
Okay, Dylan, please go ahead.
Yeah. to just go back, my biggest question on this goes back to the beginning of our conversation. And for those projects that do have existing agreements or a tag and extend, are we going to require them to actually go through an RFP application process, or are we able to make choices and then just make those direct agreements and start putting that DOJ review into place?
Group decision on that one, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think whatever you guys decide on is what we go with.
Yeah, we do have to consider capacity, field seasons, opportunity now, building on good work. Amanda, please have a comment, and then if we need to even get to some point where we're a thumbs up or thumbs down, we can do that as a group. Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, I just add that I don't think there's anything in the legislation that says we can't do that. So, you know, there's nothing specifically in the legislation that says all the money has to go through a grant program or anything. So I think that we're fully within our bounds of authority to do that, or ODF is.
Alex, you still have your hand up, or is that just a leftover? Okay.
And to be clear, Jeff, I'm not suggesting that we don't have a criteria in place for why we selected those landscapes. I mean, it's the opposite. It's saying, no, we looked at it and they've already gone through FIP review. They're already focused on wildfire risk reduction. They're already in a critical landscape. They already have a habitat benefit. They're already bringing in match. They already have a robust monitoring plan. They have contracting capacity, and they're ready to start work in March and to hit that field season, and it's going to get us another field season. So that's why we gave them $2 million. Like that's the kind of process I would imagine this group kind of validating and then putting out to the public as far as justification.
Right. Eric, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think Dylan kind of just stole exactly what I was going to say, is that there may be a public perception issue if a significant amount of the funding goes to existing projects without sort of a public process. I think. I mean, that could just be coming from an OWEB lens. But what Dylan just described, does weigh on me quite a bit, and I think it could potentially carry the day.
Mm-hmm. Well, in our experience here at ODF, I would just maybe reiterate that the process that we have gone through for years is a rigorous process that has been vetted through multiple organizations, and we can provide that. Maybe there's a comfort level, Alex, in me and you putting our heads together the rest of this week and providing the criteria for existing projects. And Andrew has some of that with his RCPPs. I mean, these projects that I'm describing have been put together over years of planning and years and multiple hours of effort of meeting criteria to get to the place that they're actually submitting a project, and then goes through multiple processes to get an award. So it's not that these projects are just, well, I don't even know how you would do that. You can't put money out on the ground without having some sort of a proposal and a process. We just don't do that. So maybe there's an opportunity for us to build that out a little bit better. Here's what I'm worried about. My staff would be doing that. That doesn't include all the projects that we may potentially be talking about. So you'd only get our lens of what we think the projects that I could present through homework over the next 5 or 6 days. So tell me if that works for you. Chandra, please go ahead.
That works for the types of projects that ODF funds, but we're talking about other things as well. So there might be homework for others, like the Forest Service or BLM or some other entity that funds these types of projects that would add on to what you're offering. But overall, I think it would be really helpful. It would mean essentially, I mean, I know it's work to put that together, but it offers a degree of confidence in what, you know, in the model that you've already produced for all of us. But also it means we don't have to reinvent the wheel if we all agree that they pass muster.
Good point. Dylan?
I mean, one thought on this, Jeff, and I mean, I am an advocate of ODF putting some of that together. I think we start with what's put in Senate Bill 762. We have a prioritization, and then we have preference criteria that's established within the bill. So that needs to go into, you know, the proposal criteria. I would then take what you all put together within the e-board process already, which has had some sort of public interface. Everyone might not be in love with it, but it's at least been socialized and been used so far, and we had a round of that. I would put those together to start that, and then maybe bring that back to the group for additional revision, refinement, and other ideas. What I might propose then is within that process, we have a lens applied to that that allows for a separate expedited review for direct agreements, which targets these existing project areas. Are you an established focused investment partnership area? Are you a CIS? Are you an RCPP? Whatever, right? And then that's how we say to the public, look, every project has to hit the same criteria, but these 5 came to us and were already in an established priority landscape designation. So they went to an expedited direct agreement review. Maybe that's how we could do it. It's just an idea. But at a minimum, I think you just take what's in the bill and what y'all did for the e-board as a starting point, and then we refine it as a group.
Yeah, good point. I was hoping that we'd kind of get there, Dylan. Thank you. And I think that that sounds very reasonable. And it's like you mentioned, it's work for us. That's what we do. That's fine. I would only remind folks that as of right now, we have state mechanisms to get money moved. And so if it's someone else's project, a Forest Service project, there are other hoops to jump through to get there, other agreements, other MOUs, things like that. And so we can tease that out as we go, but the money is in our accounts now, and we must be able to process that. So that might be a limiting factor as we look at other projects that we don't have a lot of influence over. Chris, please go ahead.
I like what was just said as a process, because I think we will find a good handful of projects that check all those boxes, and we can move some money forward faster. And I understand the need for that. Just a process point, as I pulled up the bill, section 18.2 says the department shall develop a 20-year strategic plan, blah, blah, blah. And then the plan must be able to be used to direct federal, state, and private investments in a tangible way. What is that? Sorry if I'm ignorant here, but what is that plan? Are we building that plan here, or is it something that we just haven't brought up yet?
Yeah, I'll give you a little background about that. That is a plan that is to be built throughout the remainder of the biennium. And talk about cart and horse, that cart is way out in front of this horse. And so we we won't get there in this group. That'll take 2 years. It'll be done in July of 23, and that will inform our future investments. But right now, we just are in a position that we're dealing with what we have in front of us.
Great,
Amanda,
thank you.
please go ahead.
Yeah, and I just like to put a plug in. I think that what we can get done through agreements like G&A, where the state has the ability to collect funds and reinvest funds to get more done with the taxpayer's dollar, I think that we should be utilizing that. So for instance, if some of this money is going to go to help fund additional Joint Chiefs work that results in commercial product, then ODF should do what it can to leverage that to get more work done. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity there for the state to build upon the work if we utilize the FFR program.
Thank you. Dana, I noticed a note, but I didn't catch it real quick. Sorry. Okay. Thank you. Okay, I have jotted down some marching orders for ODF, and that makes me feel good because now we have some things we can move on. Anyway, we can put together, and I think we can do this just in a really easy format for everyone to get their arms around it pretty quickly. Projects that have already passed muster, so to speak, through a process, we can tease those out to kind of show what we're talking about as far as meeting criteria that has already been developed over multiple generations of folks doing this. That's one thing we can do that would be directly coordinated with these projects on this map. The second point, I think, to Dylan's point, and please correct me, Dylan, but I think that we might even be looking at an opportunity to almost fast track projects that we feel comfortable with that have met that, and then build on that criteria for a second round that may go out that meets the needs of really the larger need of what we're all talking about. And so that's additional projects that meet that landscape. So I'm feeling really good about collecting that over the next few days and kind of building out a draft of what that may look like. I think that would be really productive for us to put in front of you. And I don't think this is the venue to do it. I'm not frustrated, but this is hard to do. So it's an email. I mean, we're starting to really coordinate over, our time looking at this stuff in detail. I think that's the way we get there. The one thing that I'm not sure that in my mind I'm getting at yet is what are we going to do about defining landscapes? And so where do we get there? How do we get there?
And the only primer I'd put on this, Jeff, is that, I mean, the information that we have now is what we'll be going with moving forward. So the WUI RAC rules are going to be developed after this, and that at that point that'll be incorporated into the 20-year strategic plan. So the priority landscapes that we're talking about here really are kind of version 1 to be improved upon in the shared stewardship 20-year strategic plan. So I definitely don't want you guys thinking we're making a 20-year decision here based on our current information. It's much more what's gonna help us prioritize the next 2 years of funding.
Okay, thank you, Alex. And to Andrew's point earlier, maybe we get there by looking at this map, and we all understand that there are layers here that point to 2 or 3 or 4 locations in the state that are strategic or high priority. Fine. That being said, through a point system that we build in our criteria, that doesn't mean we can't do projects outside of those areas. And that could be built into the criteria that we put together as a group that says, you're in one of these, you get 5 points. You're outside one of these, you may get 3 points, but we're looking at other criteria throughout the process to allow projects outside of those areas to be funded. Is that a way of getting around that and allowing us the opportunity to fund other projects? Pete, please go ahead.
Sorry, I think Dylan was maybe first. I was on another
screen.
Dylan,
I missed it.
On another screen trying to review the bill language, but Dylan, do you want to go?
I was going to cede the floor to Pete and Chris and Dana as our actual scientific experts on this to kind of define landscape scale and how we want to hit that threshold as far as a bar that projects need to establish.
Well, what I was going to say was simply that, like in my reading of section, let me go back. So sorry, I'm on a single laptop screen, so I'm not looking at you. I'm looking at the bill right now, but section 18, subsection 3, letter A, giving priority to projects within the landscapes that are, is this the section? I mean, to me, I think that to me, and maybe I'm just misreading the bill, but to me, I think there are core criteria within the legislative language that tell us I don't think we need to draw arbitrary lines on a map. I think the criteria are going to be what identify what those priority landscapes are. So I think I don't know if this is what I interpreted Dylan's comment earlier in terms of giving you, Jeff, some marching orders. But to me, I think both a transparent and an explicit process to really just document what those criteria are going to start to give us a suggestion of what those priority landscapes are based on the stated criteria.
So, yeah, that's a great point, Pete. And I mean, that's actually, we've got a lot of that here on this map. So, I mean, priority landscapes being the 4 highest risk classes, you know, wild and urban interface is mentioned. So, I mean, that was the point of us bringing this map to you guys today, is that it really does kind of call out, you know, where we're being directed to prioritize. Yep, you'll see those 4 risk classes, and that's the big piece there. And so, you know, if I'm looking at this map, I'm seeing high risk WUI in Southern Oregon around Ashland, right? I'm seeing some up and around Bend, and that seems to not be an arbitrary line on the map necessarily, but definitely the areas that have overlapping objectives and criteria established in the bill. And again, we don't have to, you know, it doesn't have to be a you're in and you're out type conversation. It can be a, you know, these are the general areas that we'd like to focus on. And then the homework would be for this group to actually bring those general areas, reviewing bill criteria and other objectives from various, you know, from your stakeholder community on, you know, where we might chisel away at that to get a little bit more specific. Is that making sense to folks? I mean, I'm thinking that's the task in front of us here, is to identify some general areas and then to go back to, you know, the broader community that we're all in, reviewing bill language, science informed, all that, and kind of, you know, better defining those areas. And so if we can just identify some general regions on the map, I think that would be, you know, that might be enough for us to take back and then, you know, put an overlay on where within these areas do we have strategy landscapes for the U.S. Forest Service, you know, RCPP and Nrcs, contractor scarcity, capacity issues. I mean, that's really what I'm hoping that we could do in between now and the next meeting, is identify a general area that we can go and research individually.
Great points. We've got some hands up. I'll just meter through them just right. Dylan, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to support what Alex just said. I mean, I think that was our expectation. I think it meets built intent. I misspoke when I said landscape scale. I think what is unique here that we need to make sure we add to that criteria is that the goal was to not do a bunch of 50-acre projects, right? And that it had to be a large, concentrated, strategic area where we were working. And then within that footprint, there would be a project or a series of projects that would be contiguous enough that we could then be able to say that we've made a measurable change in condition on the ground. And that was really kind of the legislative intent behind this section. So as long as we can capture that and prioritize those areas, I think that's sufficient if you can write that down.
Amanda, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, Alex, you specifically mentioned WUI, which does not show up in this section. So I know that there's the specific piece that says, you know, focusing on treatments protective of human life, property, critical infrastructure, watershed health. You know, those are one thing. That's one thing on the list, but it's not the only thing. So, you know, also on inclusive of federal lands with treatment projects currently approved under NEPA, that would be way, you know, that those are not always projects and often are not projects that are directly within the WUI as well. Plus, again, as you noted, we're still trying to find exactly what that is in the state. So anyways, I just wanted to make that point that we made at the first meeting, that there's a lot of effects of fire to communities that aren't necessarily specifically adjacent to communities as well.
Yep. Great point, Amanda. And I didn't mean that we'd be focusing on the WUI specifically, but I think to Dylan's point, the idea of strategy landscapes, you know, there would be overlap in WUI and, you know, federal lands, non-populated lands to kind of have a measurable impact on condition. Passing over to Chandra.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think that's getting exactly the point that probably we'll do in one of our next meetings, which is to really lay out how we're going to rank these, right? So we might decide that there's a whole laundry list of, landscapes or types of treatments, but we want to rank, projects that are closer to communities more than other projects that are further away, or, whatever criteria you want to apply. And so that ranking, I think, is going to be important. The other point I had initially raised my hand for was, and it gets so complicated when you add layers to maps, and I don't even mean actual GIS, but considering some of the more esoteric criteria as well, making sure that we're capturing communities that are underserved by past projects, or are most in need, or at highest risk, things like that people have brought up already a little bit today. But those are going to be things that aren't specifically called out in the language of the bill, but I think we've all recognized as being important, and we just might need to work on developing language for how to define those in those ranking criteria that we're going to come up with.
Great point, Chandra. And for folks that didn't see, I did put a link in the chat for the Headwater Economics, and that's a map for disadvantaged or unequal impacts of wildfire. And so if you guys get a chance, follow that link, and that might help us kind of further define where a priority area is or isn't, or at least inform the decision. I see Eric's hand up.
Yeah, just real quick. I appreciate this discussion. Question as to where rangelands will fit here. Could they potentially be considered in the expedited review, or are they going to be in that secondary process?
Well, I think they would be in the expedited review. We would look at existing projects, and if they've met particular criteria that we see fit, and move forward with those as well in context with landscape scale projects. I wouldn't say that, just to clarify, ODF has partnered with the Forest Service for many years in receiving $300,000 and going out into the middle of nowhere and putting defensible space around structures. Well, we've burned a lot of those structures, and that really has proven not to be very effective. I mean, years ago. And so I think that each one of our projects that we are working on, we're looking at the context of, what is the larger landscape. And so rest assured, I think that any one of the projects we see on this map now has already filtered through that criteria. These are not individual rangeland or subdivision projects that don't make sense within the context of the larger landscape. I'm seeing some hands again. Dana?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think this is all outstanding conversation, and I'm looking forward to, every prioritization process I've been through, and I've done some with ODF, like Jeff talked about, all the good partnerships and DNR and other places, and then our own internal stuff. You end up coming back to the same kinds of things. Is there partnership contribution? Is it in a high risk area? Is there going to be integrated benefit on the landscape? Like, does it help with fire risk, but does it also maybe have benefits to the watershed or to some other part of ecosystem resilience? There's really not like a million different categories to choose from. So we'll probably all kind of, and we just went through this exercise internally in the agency, like, ooh, we need a hazardous fuels investment strategy. Oh, so cute. Like, we haven't had one. And then when you go through all the process, you end up with the same areas you've been focusing on all along. The thing that sometimes these help with is, have we been planning in the right areas, and could we be double down on focusing on those areas that haven't had a lot of NEPA or attention because really they're not socially ripe. And that's the piece we need to move forward, not the other parts of the discussion, right? So I think we're all going to get to a really common place. I see it happen a lot lately, but I think this conversation is a really natural part of that. I also think bigger picture with what we're seeing, you know, we get a 2016 and then we get a 2017 and a 2018. We get a 2019, then we get a 2020 and a 21. We'll get years that give us a chance to regroup, and we'll get way more than we can handle every other year. Every time we do some good work on the landscape, it pays it forward in a way that we are so glad to have had done and didn't anticipate. So like we do our prioritization model in the Forest Service, we did a scatter plot against the quantitative risk assessment to see if our trick knee approach was working in terms of science. And you know what? The only project that we funded that year that wasn't a high priority in terms of like bad net value change or potentially large unwanted fire was the project in Sycan Marsh, which was really beneficial this year, right, Pete? So that goes to say, like, sometimes the projects aren't in the flashy map identified high risk areas, but they're the high frequency fire areas. And what do? They help us button down the wildfire faster, which reduces smoke impacts to communities and releases firefighters to that higher priority fire sooner. So I think we're having really helpful conversations, and it's good for us to help get our expectations and our vision a little bit more aligned as much as anything. But what we come up with is going to have a positive impact, and it won't solve everything. And so anyway, I appreciate y'all and I appreciate the conversation, and I see us on a really good path, sharing a couple of ideas to open up what you think success might look like going forward. And thanks.
Dana, thank you so much for that nice wrap up there. And yeah, I agree completely. Whatever we put our heads together and make this work, it will be good. It will work in some context. I think that one bit that we probably should consider, and we're all in this business, so we understand Dana's language as she just described that all really made sense to us. At some point, we're going to have to take that complex picture and provide that story to folks that don't live this every day, and that includes the legislature. And so I think with the end in mind, when we do get these projects on the ground, that's really the important part, is that we're going to have to be able to pivot to those folks and let them know the successes and of what we've created here, on top of years of prior success, and into the future. So any more questions or thoughts? It's 4:51. We've got a few minutes. I can reiterate, I think, the products that me and Alex and a couple folks, Megan, will come up with in the next few days, if that's helpful, just to reiterate, or do we have some additional conversation? Pete, go ahead, please.
Well, Jeff has a question back to you or to others at ODF or Dylan. Are there, to your last point about, pivoting back to the legislature to make the case, in addition to maybe stated criteria in the bill, are there political considerations about where priority landscapes need to be considered because they're important for winning allies? I mean, I think we have to be a little bit realpolitik here, in considering project selection or project areas as well, just to make sure that, we're acknowledging that we need to have political allies, because this isn't a one biennium fix and then we're suddenly like, we can dust our hands off and say we're done with the work, right? So
right, yeah, good point. And there's other folks that are better to answer that on this call than me, I'm sure.
I mean, if I can, just really quick on Pete, his comment and thinking about how we do this. I mean, I do think we should stay focused and not spread the peanut butter too thin. I think that sweet spot is somewhere at 5 to 10 landscapes and areas where we're designating funds. I look at that map. I know you all are going to go through this exercise, and politically, I look at the districts and the distribution there. I really see Jackson and Josephine County, popping off there as far as critical support. I look at Klamath, thinking off the fire seasons that they just had there. Central Oregon, obviously, is going to be critical. Hood River and the Dalles kind of pops up there. And then Northeast Oregon and Southeast Oregon. I think we have to do at least one rangeland project, just because that is going to be important for some geographic considerations and political considerations, to not just focus on forest related issues. I also think if we can kind of focus in those 6 geographies, that's a good mix of Democrats and Republicans. It's a good mix of geographies, across the state and different uses. So I just thinking about the long-term support for it, as far as consideration goes and where those key members are located, dropping projects within those geographies is going to help us get good broad bipartisan support for this work.
Thank you, Dylan. I would only add to the group that we wouldn't be here speaking if we didn't have Labor Day fires of 20. That makes a difference to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Chandra, did you have a comment? Okay, I tell you what, just to wrap this up, this is what we're going to do then. We'll get our staff together and we'll put together a draft, and it's going to be really drafty and it's going to be all over the place. There's going to be all sorts of ideas. We'll take criteria that is in the language of 762. We'll add it to previous projects that have been vetted over years of doing this. And we'll put that together in a draft request for proposal. We'll throw in kind of another map perhaps. Anyway, we'll put that together and we'll send that out in the next couple of days for you guys to really digest and look that over and talk with your partners in crime and who you work with and all that. And we'll get something together that we can fine tune over the next couple of weeks. And I think when we circle back and have more conversation at our next meeting, maybe we'll be in a place where we're really comfortable about moving forward. And even if we find through email exchange that we're doing that, maybe we even move a little quicker than what I'm expecting. But at least that's a really good place for us to provide a document for everyone to look over. Does that work for everyone? I'm seeing some nods. Alex?
Yep. I guess the other half of it is the strategic landscapes, and I'm wondering if those areas that Dylan called out, high risk, will we interface? Do you guys want us to try and put something on the map there to visualize what that map might look like, or are we not there yet? See a nod? Okay. Again, I think
we don't have that much time.
Right. Well, I mean, Chris whipped this up pretty quick. So I mean, we might be able to get you a very rough draft of where these priority landscapes, hypothetically might be. And then just reminding folks that the criteria is really going to allow us to meet this and or make sure that we've got a equitable distribution of where these funds are. So identifying priority landscapes to really do, make some changes on the landscape fuel condition, and then criteria to round it out and make sure we're equitable about it. Amanda, you got your hand up?
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, to one of my original questions about the public notice for the strategic landscapes, if the October 25th is to be, the date where we're trying to get input from the public, then we'd have to have a map with those mapped strategic landscapes out to the public with enough time for them to be able to come to that meeting having seen that. So I guess I just put that out to the group, that we do need to identify those. And one question I would have, and we don't have to answer it here now in the next 3 minutes, but with that recognition of wanting to include, or the bill talking about wanting to include places that already have NEPA or that are NEPA ready, would we want to include all those kind of points on the map? I mean, they're polygons, but points on the map, or would we just include whole forests, national forests and BLM districts to be more inclusive? I guess just ponder on that. I don't know the right answer, but I wouldn't want to exclude things just because there isn't maybe current NEPA there, but there could be NEPA getting worked on. So anyways, again, we don't have to answer that question, but something to ponder.
Thank you. One final question that I have for you that I'd forgotten, excuse me. There's been a request for, on the external webpage, that not only are folks, associations and organizations, but names. Are we comfortable with putting Amanda Astor AOL, Dylan Cruz Sustainable Northwest? I don't see any real heartache over that. Nods? Okay. Then we'll just make sure that that's added and folks know that's available. I would only say that you'll get an email from us in the next couple of days with the summary of these notes you can review, draft product, perhaps a scoring and ranking sheet that we've used in years past, that you might be able to kind of forecast out what that may look like. And then a little bit more information about the October 25th meeting. Thank you all very much for your time. Always appreciated. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chip.